Hello, and welcome to Climate Resiliency as an Act of Love. I am Reverend Carol Devine, Director of Eco America's faith program called Blessed Tomorrow. The webinar today is being co-hosted by One Home, One Future in partnership with the Mennonite Church USA. We invite you to join One Home, One Future to learn more about resilience, disaster preparedness, and creation care and climate justice. Join at onehomeonefuture.org for ongoing climate and faith support through free resources, trainings, events, and connections to a growing community of over 100,000 people of faith across the U.S., supported by 45 denominational and faith partners like Mennonite Church USA, So now I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Carla. Carla?
Thanks, Carol. It's a pleasure to be a partner in this webinar today. I am Carla Stoltzfus-Duttweiler, Climate Justice Coordinator for Mennonite Church USA. I'd like to open our time today with a prayer. Please pray with me. Creator God, you are our refuge and strength, and ever-present help in times of trouble. As climate disasters grow in frequency and intensity, we call on your wisdom and compassion to guide us. We give thanks for this time of learning. Grant our congregations courage and creativity that we may offer refuge and care to our neighbors. Amen. We're pleased to welcome two speakers today who offer their experience and expertise for our faith communities to learn from. We welcome Josh Richardson. Josh is the Executive Director and founder of Brugmansia Ministries, and also the pastor of St. Louis Mennonite Fellowship in St. Louis, Missouri. Thanks for joining us today, Josh. And Reverend Kara Foster. Kara serves as the Senior Minister of First Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Madisonville, Kentucky. Kara brings skills in social work and pastoral care to her ministry. Thanks so much for joining us, Kara. I'll turn it over to Josh now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carla. So good afternoon, everyone. As Carla mentioned, my name is Josh. I'm the director of Brugmansia Ministries, and I also serve as the pastor of St. Louis Mennonite Fellowship and on the steering committee of Creation Justice Network, which is an organization of American Baptist Churches USA. So technically, Brugmansia Ministries focuses on changing faith community ministries to meet the needs of climate change and climate-induced migration. But really, we're interested in helping communities thrive amidst our current environmental and social challenges, which means understanding the big picture questions around climate change and climate-induced displacement migration. So I'm grateful to be with you all today to have a conversation that is increasingly vital to both the health and safety of our communities and the survival of our faith organizations. Climate change is already profoundly impacting every aspect of our lives. Within our broader communities, we're already witnessing increased challenges with things like food insecurity that's tied to declines in agricultural production from flooding, droughts, and heat waves, leading to inflation on food prices. Unaffordability of insurance, as our insurance companies change their business practices to incorporate climate risks. We're losing access to potable water as flooding, droughts, and wildfires diminish and incapacitate foundational critical infrastructure. Or we're also seeing mental health crises, domestic violence, and suicide crises that are all tied to climate anxiety and environmental pressures. And I've just provided a brief list. I'm sure each and every one of us could all identify many ways in which climate change is impacting our local communities. Specifically for our faith communities, we're on the front lines of these climate disasters. When folks cannot afford to eat because food prices are too high, they arrive at our pantries and our soup kitchens. When families cannot afford to pay their electricity bills to provide air conditioning for their infants amidst record heat waves, they indiscriminately call faith communities for the slim hope of financial charity. When wildfires or floods destroy people's homes and they have nowhere to go, they come to our doors because we care about their well-being. And it's not just the folks outside of our walls who are suffering. Within each of our faith communities, every single person is dealing with challenges and traumas of climate change, even if they do not recognize those things as such. Issues like gentrification, political destabilization, financial insecurity and instability, and an overall sense of unwellness permeate our modern life. And all of those things are fed and are enhanced by climate change. So today, instead of focusing on mitigation or what is climate change, we're going to be asking the questions of how do we help folks who are already in the midst of climate crisis. This is the question of our time. For our faith communities, it's also the real question of relevance in the 21st century. How do we become wise, strong, and resilient so that we can meet the needs of our neighbors and our communities when they're vulnerable? And what does it look like to love others when the world around us is in turmoil? And concretely, how do we prepare for that? So I'm excited to be with you here today to listen to Pastor Foster as they tell us about their journey in meeting their community's needs during a climate crisis.
Hey, I'm Kara Foster, and I'm with First Christian Church in Madisonville, Kentucky. We're over here in Western Kentucky. And in December of 2021, a 100-plus-mile tornado devastated this part of our region. And our church, thankfully, besides losing some big, beautiful trees, was okay. But we immediately began to think about how we can help our community rebuild in the aftermath. And one thing our church had was space. And we happened to have 2 showers that we had put in a new wing that we had built on the church. And so we reached out to our denominational disaster response ministry, and they connected us to another nonprofit. And we've been partnering with the Fuller Center Disaster Rebuilders for the last 2.5 years to host groups in our church site so that they can have the volunteers to help rebuild and fix houses. And we've been enormously blessed by this experience. And in our church, one thing I realized is that for us to respond to this disaster, it was another disaster before that. It was an ice storm almost a decade earlier, where the church realized they weren't prepared to help others in the ways that they wanted to. So we did some things at that time. We put some money aside specifically in the bank so that we could have funds on hand to buy generators if we needed them. And we also contacted our Red Cross and our local city and county emergency management to get our names on the list to let them know about our facility, what we had, and what we'd be willing to offer. And I have found that thinking about that a decade earlier made us so much more ready to be able to help when it happened in 2021. So that's a little glimpse of our story. You want to tell us more, Josh?
Yeah, thank you for passing that back.
Yeah.
I'm juggling a little bit. So thank you for the moving and empowering story. You know, it's really enheartening to hear stories like that of faith communities where you're identifying the steps in advance and then you're ready and prepared to meet larger community needs. I think it's so important to have those sort of tangible examples ready and available. So I'm going to share screen, do a bit of a PowerPoint now. So I'm going to step back and have a bit of a sort of practical conversation around how each of our faith communities can really start this work and how we can start thinking about it. It's not going to be an exhaustive presentation, but really just a framework to get each of us started in thinking about this work. For anyone who is interested, I'm sure any of us, myself included, would be happy to have these larger conversations around resilience and planning and how we can get going. Before we really dig into some of the practical steps, I want to take a step to talk a little bit of theory. So as faith communities, we're all situated within a network of aid providers for vulnerable people, which include public entities like government, services, police, firefighter departments, libraries, and other emergency responders. There are also things like public-private charities and organizations like hospitals, nonprofits, counseling centers, other faith communities, and then there are things like private institutions and businesses and individuals. Climate change is not simply about CO2 production or even standalone problems like plant germination. Each of our interconnected environmental and social problems created by climate change, they're diminishing our capacity of our physical infrastructure and of our support organizations to meet the needs of vulnerable folks in our communities in different ways, while at the same time increasing the number and severity of vulnerable individuals. So not only are we dealing with increased challenges from climate change, we're also having a diminished capacity to meet those needs. So just to provide you with a brief real-world example of this, and one that we might not see or think about in our everyday life, India has undergone 2 years of intense droughts and heat waves that have damaged their agricultural sector, which is incredibly unlikely without climate change. These droughts and heat waves have impeded rice and wheat production for export. From 2022 to today, the global price of rice has risen around 15%, which means that folks who rely on rice as a staple food are paying more for rice. Obviously, this price increase can have large implications for folks who are purchasing rice as a necessary cheap food, but it also decreases the effective operating budgets of our support systems as they're also paying for more for goods like rice, while receiving less in giving from individuals who are continually paying for that inflation as well. And so we can see that these outside forces are affecting everything from our operations to our sort of functioning of our organizations. And for our faith communities, the changing resource and need landscape is both a challenge and it's an opportunity. There are new and emergent needs from climate change in our communities that are currently not being met, and it's projected to get worse. So as people who believe in the thriving of all life, we not only have an opportunity to meet that need, but speaking personally as a Christian, we have a spiritual responsibility to meet those needs. But to meet those needs, or in other words, to love our neighbors, we need to change how we're thinking about our buildings, our missions, and our faiths. So to step back, I say this is an opportunity because in the United States, we have a narrative in many people that our faith communities don't care about other people. And because the basis of many faiths is the care of others, this ideal that we espouse seems hollow and fake. But directly addressing emergent community needs is a great opportunity for our faith communities to really live into our missions of serving others when there's no one else there to help them. So how do we get started? First, we need to understand the potential climate impacts relating to our community and our community needs. These impacts from climate change can generally be broken down into three broad categories. We're dealing with baseline or chronic changes to our physical and social systems. This includes things like agricultural declines, climate gentrification, restricted water usage, and political destabilization. There are also more catastrophic events, which you see in the center, which we hear about more in our newspapers. These are things like floods, droughts, wildfires, tornadoes, famines, polar vortexes. Finally, there's something else that we don't think about much often, or at least doesn't get much covered, and these are the transitional impacts of climate change. And these are things that change in our communities from how we're trying to deal with climate change. So, for example, the movement to reduce carbon dioxide through electrification requires a lot of copper. And there are very real questions around community exploitation and suffering in metal production. So it's helpful to not only see the direct impacts of climate change when we're thinking about how to change our ministries, but also these indirect impacts and justice questions. So to get our local information from projected impact, there are plenty of sources available, and I'm only going to cover a brief few ways that you can start thinking about finding resources to how your community will be impacted. So one of the great resources, it's a really great starting place. The United States government produces climate assessments. Their most recent one is the 5th National Climate Assessment. It's a really great place to read in relatively readable terms how climate change is going to affect regions and what those impacts are likely to be, and what those will look like. The First Street Foundation does parcel scale risk, climate risk. So that's individual building scale risk assessments. So you can go there and you can look at how individual properties are potentially going to be impacted. And so as you can see in this graph, they're talking about the number of days over 90 degrees for St. Louis. This is where I live. And so I'm thinking about how do we become a cooling station in my community? This is my direct impact that I'm saying, okay, if we're looking at, 50 days over the year is going to be over 100 degrees in St. Louis, we really need better cooling infrastructure. My church can do that. FEMA produces the National Risk Index. This is a county scale risk index, so you can look at the national your disaster risks, and this will tell you a whole bunch of different risks and what those are, and they've quantified that. So again, you can look at here in St. Louis, and because we're on the New Madrid Fault, we have a relatively moderate risk for earthquakes, whereas we're not very likely in the middle of the country for hurricanes, and that's going to change community to community. And so again, we can begin to prepare and see how those different impacts, how your community might be impacted. And those also, the risk index is really nice because it'll give you numbers associated too, so financial numbers of risk. So you can sort of see how big the risks are going to be for your local county. There are also really wonderful just local reports. So there are local governmental reports and state governmental reports. So for example, each community is required to report the risk to their water sources. So they file a source water assessment with the EPA. And so you can look at how vulnerable your water sources are to contamination. And so you can begin to think, so we're seeing in many communities now, like recently in Atlanta, they lost their potable water. But more famously, Jackson, Mississippi lost water from flooding a couple years ago. And so you can begin to see what the risks are of actually losing your fresh water and your ability to drinking water. And so you can think about things like bottled water and things like that. So there are a lot of this information is covered in state level reports. And so out of the national, but you can really get into the local and state level. And there are also municipal government risks. So you can see how the municipal government is planning for natural disaster response. And that's often covered as well in those local reports. So the next question we have from our faith community perspective is, how do we respond to these needs that we can predict and see? There's a quote that I love by Bill Mollison, who's famous in the world of permaculture. That's a form of regenerative agriculture. And his quote is, "The problem is the solution." For our faith communities, often our buildings and grounds are seen as necessary liabilities to our ministries. They're really nice meeting places and offices that for many of our faith communities are now physical and financial burdens because they were built in a different life cycle of that faith community, and they're currently underutilized in our current form. So even churches that fill our buildings on days of worship, those same buildings remain largely unused most of the week. But for climate change and community level suffering, we can see that underutilization as a great potential to meet a larger community need. And again, I don't want to get too far into the weeds in this short presentation, but there are many ways that we can evaluate our own faith buildings to see different potentials to meet community needs. We can do things that look at like previous land use history. So you can look at aerial photographs. You can look at the soil types outside. So can you grow and produce food? We can look at how your energy is being used. Are there opportunities to figure out during the day when you're using energy, or use less energy and save that money and invest it? And so I'm going to end now with some concrete steps that faith communities are already taking to meet their community needs in these sort of creative ways. To help with the challenges of hunger, North Park Presbyterian Church in Dallas, Texas has converted some of their land into a hydroponic food production, where they're growing thousands of pounds of tomatoes a year that go directly into their local food banks. Parkway UCC in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, have converted their outside land into a permaculture food forest where folks can freely come and take food. It's super cool. Also, the Black Church Food Security Network is promoting community gardens and conventional agriculture on church grounds for Black churches to meet community needs. And I imagine as climate change continues to intensify, we'll see all sorts of interesting ways that faith communities are additionally meeting food needs, so vertical gardens or other things like that. To address the challenges of flooding, faith communities are converting their turf grass back into native plants. We're installing things like retention ponds, permeable pavement, rain gardens, or in the case of Waterford Mennonite Church, they've restored the native wetland on their property, which will help with flooding not just in their local area, but across their entire watershed. Also, in instances of massive floods, many faith communities are increasingly adopting emergency response plans where they're opening as shelters for housing folks they know will be displaced by folks not just in their own community, but who may be moving into their community from flooding from outside. To manage the challenges of heat waves, faith communities are using their buildings as cooling stations and shelters. So for example, Wesley United Methodist Church in Phoenix, Arizona, they converted an entire wing of an old preschool for respite and center for heat waves. We're also seeing faith communities and urban centers plant trees on their property to provide shade and to produce cooler microclimates around their buildings so that unhoused folks will be able to avoid the effects of the urban heat islands. In situations where electricity is being lost on community scales, like the wildfires in California, churches are installing solar panels with battery backups to provide foundational resources like electricity for dialysis machines, when otherwise folks would have nowhere to turn when they need dialysis because our hospitals are being overrun. So I want to end there and give Carol a chance to talk about the great resources One Home, One Future has created to help you in this process of really addressing these challenges. But if you leave this webinar with anything, I hope you leave with a sense that our faith communities are in a uniquely flexible and valuable position to meet the needs of our neighbors amidst climate change, only if we're willing to think about our buildings, our grounds, and our spirituality a little bit differently. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, as you were talking, it reminded me that the church that I pastored has had a community garden for going on 20 years that both supports the neighborhood around it, but also the church's food pantry, which is wonderful. Our building also was used and still is used for exercise class for senior citizens in the area. And our building was named as an evacuation space for a nearby nursing home, if that's ever needed. All really important things that support what you were just talking about. But I also just want to say that over a decade ago, I did initiate a disaster preparedness process in the congregation that I pastored for 9 years, starting with the board, of course. And then I served with a committee that was appointed by that board to do this work. And I thought that this example might be helpful for folks today. We created a big three-ring binder where we added information as we went through this process that included a communication plan in case of emergency, the location of all the shut-off valves for utilities. It had contacts of local officials, our insurance contacts. And through this process, we met with local leaders, our insurance agency, and also we educated all the church leaders about the plan. And there was a lot more to it than that. It was actually went on for almost a year. But not only was that work really important, I want folks, going back to your point of the problem is also the solution, that we were brought so much more together through this process of all of us being educated and participating and thinking about all of the ways that emergencies and disasters might hit our area, which, like you in St. Louis, was not likely to have hurricane impacts, but could have tornadoes and other impacts, and heat, of course. And from that experience and in partnership with many faith leaders, One Home, One Future has created a checklist and so many resources like the ones being shared today that can help support any congregation through a disaster preparedness process, like my congregation and like Reverend Kara's church, so that we aren't caught off guard and can not only be prepared for our immediate community, but also the wider local community that we serve. So I'm going to turn it back over now to Kara and Joss to tell us more about the importance of being places of sanctuary.
Hey, thank you. Do you want to go first, Carrie? Or do you want me to talk a little bit?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. Hearing Carol talk, it reminds me of just we've been at it for about 2.5 years now, and I will say, there have been some inconveniences along the way. We've had to be more creative about sharing space and putting groups in different places. But beyond those inconveniences, our church has been incredibly blessed. I can't help but we've been in a period of growth. And I think it's a large part and due to the fact that we opened our doors 2.5 years ago, and blessings, it truly is more blessed to give than to receive. And our church has understood that in profound ways. I've seen our church just be so proud of what they've been able to do. And the whole body of Christ has gotten smaller and more together as we welcome people in our doors and welcome people on Sunday mornings, Mennonites and Brethrens and Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians and disciples. That has enriched our whole congregational lives that I think we're going to be living out for a generation. And so that's been one of the amazing things about being a part of service this way.
Yeah, it's so heartening to hear the life that this is bringing into your community. The title of this webinar has been Climate Resilience as an Act of Love. And what we've really been talking about in my mind is changing our practices and our buildings to prepare for natural disasters to meet our neighbors' needs. So in the United States, we don't need to look very far to see the crises of our faith communities. Across the board, our faith communities are getting smaller and older statistically, and in many ways, I feel like we've lost much of the moral authority that we once had. So for our faith communities, I know we're not just dealing with climate crises. We're dealing with an authenticity crisis where our actions haven't often matched our lofty ideas of loving our neighbors all the time. And for many folks, that disconnect makes supporting our organizations difficult. To be clear, we haven't become less spiritual in the United States, we've just become maybe a little less trusting of our faith organizations. So taking care of our neighbors in climate crisis is one of the ways that we can tangibly show our love and our commitment to our beliefs that we should all be working for a better world. Not only is climate change the greatest challenge of our time, but it's also the greatest opportunity for our faith communities to show their commitment to a thriving humanity. And the good news for me is that we have tangible and concrete ways to do this. We don't have to watch our neighbors starve, folks die in our streets from heat exhaustion, or watch displaced families desperately go from hotel to hotel to be turned away because the shelters are all full and they have nowhere to stay. Every single time we see an unhoused individual die from heat exposure during a record heat wave is a spiritual failing of our faith communities if we refuse to open our doors. Every time we turn someone away who needs food, we as faith communities have failed to live into the imagination and hope that our faiths bring forth. We can meet people's needs amidst climate crises. We know how to do that. In fact, many of our communities already are. And so this is our chance to really live into the mission that we feel we are called to as people of faith. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you to Blessed Tomorrow and to MCUSA for having me. And I will pass things back to Carla.
Thank you so much, Josh and Kara and Carol. Your stories are inspiring. You've also given us some practical steps and tools, resources to turn to so that our congregations in each of our locations can become a resource and really embody the love of God in this climate changed world. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for all who are viewing this webinar. Just hope that this conversation today makes ripples of love and action all across our nation and our faith communities. And I just want to leave you all with a blessing today. May God, our refuge, shelter and fortify us, that we may offer refuge to others. May God, who fills the hungry, fill us with love and grant us a consuming hunger for justice, for our communities and for our world. Amen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Amen. Thank you.